Chapter 2, Mascot. June 27th of that year, 1937, Joe Louis knocked out James J. Braddock to become the heavyweight champion of the world. And all the Negroes in Lansing, like Negroes everywhere, went wildly happy with the greatest celebration of race pride our generation had ever known. Every Negro boy old enough to walk wanted to be the next Brown Bomber. My brother Filbert, who had already become a pretty good boxer in school, was no exception. I was trying to play basketball. I was gangling and tall, but I wasn't very good at it. Too awkward. In the fall of that year, Filbert entered the amateur bouts that were held in Lansing's Pruden Auditorium. He did well, surviving the increasingly tough eliminations. I would go down to the gym and watch him train. It was very exciting. Perhaps without realizing it, I became secretly envious. For one thing, I know I could not help seeing some of my younger brother Reginald's lifelong admiration for me getting siphoned off to Filbert. People praised Filbert as a natural boxer. I figured that since we belonged to the same family, maybe I would become one too. So I put myself in the ring. I think I was 13 when I signed up for my first bout, but my height and raw-boned frame let me get away with claiming that I was 16, the minimum age, and my weight of about 128 pounds got me classified as a bantamweight. They matched me with a white boy, a novice like myself named Bill Peterson. I'll never forget him. When our turn in the next amateur bouts came up, all of my brothers and sisters were there watching, along with just about everyone else I knew in town. They were there not so much because of me, but because of Filbert, who had begun to build up a pretty good following, and they wanted to see how his brother would do. I walked down the aisle between the people thronging the rows of seats and climbed in the ring. Bill Peterson and I were introduced, and then the referee called us together and mumbled all of that stuff about fighting fair and breaking clean. Then the bell rang, and we came out of our corners. I knew I was scared, but I didn't know, as Bill Peterson told me later on, that he was scared of me, too. He was so scared I was going to hurt him that he knocked me down 50 times if he did once. He did such a job on my reputation in the Negro neighborhood that I practically went into hiding. A Negro just can't be whipped by somebody white and return with his head up in the neighborhood, especially in those days when sports and, to a lesser extent, show business were the only fields open to Negroes, and when the ring was the only place a Negro could whip a white man and not be lynched. When I did show my face again, the Negroes I knew rode me so badly, I knew I had to do something. But the worst of my humiliations was my younger brother Reginald's attitude. He simply never mentioned the fight. It was the way he looked at me and avoided looking at me. So I went back to the gym and I trained hard. I beat bags and skipped rope and grunted and sweated all over the place. And finally, I signed up to fight Bill Peterson again. This time, the bouts were held in his hometown of Alma, Michigan. The only thing better about the rematch was that hardly anyone I knew was there to see it. I was particularly grateful for Reginald's absence. The moment the bell rang, I saw a fist, then the canvas coming up, and 10 seconds later the referee was saying 10 over me. It was probably the shortest fight in history. I lay there listening to the full count, but I couldn't move. To tell the truth, I'm not sure I wanted to move. That white boy was the beginning and end of my fight career. A lot of times in these years later, since I've become a Muslim, I've thought back to that fight and reflected that it was Allah's work to stop me. I might have wound up punchy. Not long after this, I came into a classroom with my hat on. I did it deliberately. The teacher, who was white, ordered me to keep the hat on and to walk around and around the room until he told me to stop. That way, he said, everyone can see you. Meanwhile, we'll go on with class for those who are here to learn something. I was still walking around when he got up from his desk and turned to the blackboard to write something on it. Everyone in the classroom was looking when, at this moment, I passed behind his desk, snatched up a thumbtack, and deposited it in his chair. When he turned to sit back down, I was far from the scene of the crime, circling around the rear of the room. Then he hit the tack, and I heard him holler and caught a glimpse of him spraddling up as I disappeared through the door. With my deportment record, I wasn't really shocked when the decision came that I had been expelled. I guess I must have had some vague idea that if I didn't have to go to school, I'd be allowed to stay on with the Gohanneses and wander around town or maybe get a job if I wanted one for pocket money. But I got rocked on my heels when a state man whom I hadn't seen before came and got me at the Gohanneses and took me down to court. They told me I was going to a reform school. I was still 13 years old. But first I was going to the detention home. It was in Mason, Michigan, about 12 miles from Lansing. The detention home was where all the bad boys and girls from Ingham County were held on their way to reform school, waiting for their hearings. The white state man was a Mr. Maynard Allen. He was nicer to me than most of the state welfare people had been. He even had consoling words for the Gohanneses and Mrs. Adcock and Big Boy. All of them were crying, but I wasn't. With the few clothes I owned stuffed into a box, we rode in his car to Mason. He talked as we drove along, saying that my school marks showed that if I would just straighten up, I could make something of myself. He said that reform school had the wrong reputation. He talked about what the word reform meant, to change and become better. He said the school was really a place where boys like me could have time to see their mistakes and start a new life and become somebody everyone could be proud of. And he told me that the lady in charge of the detention home, a Mrs. Swirlin, and her husband were very good people. They were good people. Mrs. Swirlin was bigger than her husband. I remember a big, buxom, robust, laughing woman, and Mr. Swirlin was thin with black hair and a black mustache and a red face, quiet and polite even to me. They liked me right away, too. Mrs. Swirlin showed me to my room, my own room, the first in my life. It was one of those huge dormitory-like buildings where kids in detention were kept in those days, and still are in most places. I discovered next, with surprise, that I was allowed to eat with the Swirlins. It was the first time I'd eaten with white people, at least with grown white people, since the Seventh-day Adventist country meetings. It wasn't my own exclusive privilege, of course. Except for the very troublesome boys and girls at the detention home who were kept locked up, those who had run away and been caught and brought back or something like that, all of us ate with the Swirlings, sitting at the head of the long tables. They had a white cook helper, I recall, Lucille Lathrop. It amazes me how these names come back from a time I haven't thought about for more than 20 years. Lucille treated me well, too. Her husband's name was Dwayne Lathrop. He worked somewhere else, but he stayed there at the detention home on the weekends with Lucille. I noticed again how white people smelled different from us and how their food tasted different, not seasoned like Negro cooking. I began to sweep and mop and dust around in the Swirlins' home, as I had done with Big Boy at the Gohanneses. They all liked my attitude, and it was out of their liking for me that I soon became accepted by them as a mascot I know now. They would talk about anything and everything with me standing right there hearing them, the same way people would talk freely in front of a pet canary. They would even talk about me or about niggers as though I wasn't there, as if I wouldn't understand what the word meant. 100 times a day they used the word nigger. I suppose that in their own minds they meant no harm. In fact, they probably meant well. It was the same with the cook, Lucille, and her husband, Dwayne. I remember one day when Mr. Swirlin, as nice as he was, came in from Lansing, where he had been through the Negro section, and said to Mrs. Swirlin right in front of me, "I just can't see how those niggers can be so happy and be so poor." He talked about how they lived in shacks but had those big shining cars out front. And Mrs. Swirlin said, Me standing right there. Niggers are just that way. That scene always stayed with me. It was the same with the other white people, most of them local politicians, when they would come over visiting the Swirlins. One of their favorite parlor topics was niggers. One of them was the judge who was in charge of me in Lansing. He was a close friend of the Swirlins. He would ask about me when he came, and they would call me in, and he would look me up and down, his expression approving, like he was examining a fine colt or a pedigree pup. I knew they must have told him how I acted and how I worked. What I am trying to say is that it just never dawned upon them that I could understand that I wasn't a pet but a human being. They didn't give me credit for having the same sensitivity, intellect, and understanding that they would have been ready and willing to recognize in a white boy in my position. But it has historically been the case with white people in their regard for black people that even though we might be with them, we weren't considered of them. Even though they appeared to have opened the door, it was still closed. Thus, they never did really see me. This is the sort of kindly condescension which I try to clarify today to these integration-hungry Negroes about their liberal white friends, these so-called good white people, most of them anyway. I don't care how nice one is to you. The thing you must always remember is that almost never does he really see you as he sees himself, as he sees his own kind. He may stand with you through thin, but not thick. When the chips are down, you'll find that as fixed in him as his bone structure is his sometimes subconscious conviction that he's better than anybody black. But I was no more than vaguely aware of anything like that in my detention home years. I did my little chores around the house, and everything was fine. And each weekend, they didn't mind my catching a ride over to Lansing for the afternoon or evening. If I wasn't old enough, I sure was big enough by then, and nobody ever questioned my hanging out, even at night, in the streets of the Negro section. I was growing up to be even bigger than Wilfred and Filbert, who had begun to meet girls at the school dances and other places and introduce me to a few. But the ones who seemed to like me, I didn't go for, and vice versa. I couldn't dance a lick anyway, and I couldn't see squandering my few dimes on girls. So mostly I pleasured myself these Saturday nights by gawking around the Negro bars and restaurants. The jukeboxes were wailing Erskine Hawkins' Tuxedo Junction, Slim and Slam's Flatfoot Floogie, things like that. Sometimes big bands from New York, out touring one-night stands in the sticks, would play for big dances in Lansing. Everybody with legs would come out to see any performer who bore the magic name New York, which is how I first heard Lucky Thompson and Milt Jackson, both of whom I later got to know well in Harlem. Many youngsters from the detention home, when their dates came up, went off to the reform school, but when mine came up, 2 or 3 times, it was always ignored. I saw new youngsters arrive and leave. I was glad and grateful. I knew it was Mrs. Swirlin's doing. I didn't want to leave. She finally told me one day that I was going to be entered in Mason Junior High School. It was the only school in town. No ward of the detention home had ever gone to school there, at least while still a ward, so I entered their 7th grade. The only other Negroes there were some of the Lyons children, younger than I was, in the lower grades. The Lyonses and I, as it happened, were the town's only Negroes. They were, as Negroes, very much respected. Mr. Lyons was a smart, hard-working man, and Mrs. Lyons was a very good woman. She and my mother, I had heard my mother say, were 2 of the 4 West Indians in that whole section of Michigan. Some of the white kids at school, I found, were even friendlier than some of those in Lansing had been, though some, including the teachers, called me nigger. It was easy to see that they didn't mean any more harm by it than the Swirlins. As the nigger of my class, I was, in fact, extremely popular. I suppose partly because I was kind of a novelty. I was in demand. I had top priority. But I also benefited from the special prestige of having the seal of approval from that very important woman about the town of Mason, Mrs. Swirlin. Nobody in Mason would have dreamed of getting on the wrong side of her. It became hard for me to get through a school day without someone after me to join this or head up that, the debating society, the junior high basketball team, or some other extracurricular activity. I never turned them down. And I hadn't been in the school long when Mrs. Swirlin, knowing I could use spending money of my own, got me a job after school washing the dishes in a local restaurant. My boss there was the father of a white classmate whom I spent a lot of time with. His family lived over the restaurant. It was fine working there. Every Friday night when I got paid, I'd feel at least 10 feet tall. I forget how much I made, but it seemed like a lot. It was the first time I'd ever had any money to speak of all my own in my whole life. As soon as I could afford it, I bought a green suit and some shoes, and at school I'd buy treats for the others in my class, at least as much as any of them did for me. English and history were the subjects I liked the most. My English teacher, I recall, a Mr. Ostrowski, was always giving advice about how to become something in life. The one thing I didn't like about history class was that the teacher, Mr. Williams, was a great one for nigger jokes. One day during my first week at school, I walked into the room and he started singing to the class as a joke, "Way down yonder in the cotton field, some folks say that a nigger won't steal." Very funny. I liked history, but I never thereafter had much liking for Mr. Williams. Later, I remember we came to the textbook section on Negro history. It was exactly one paragraph long. Mr. Williams laughed through it practically in a single breath, reading aloud how the Negroes had been slaves and then were freed, and how they were usually lazy and dumb and shiftless. He added, I remember, an anthropological footnote on his own, telling us between laughs how Negroes' feet were so big that when they walk, they don't leave tracks, they leave a hole in the ground. I'm sorry to say that the subject I most disliked was mathematics. I've thought about it. I think the reason was that mathematics leaves no room for argument. If you made a mistake, that was all there was to it. Basketball was a big thing in my life, though. I was on the team. We traveled to neighboring towns such as Howell and Charlotte, and whenever I showed my face, the audiences in the gymnasiums niggered and cooned me to death, or called me Rastus. It didn't bother my teammates or my coach at all, and to tell the truth, it bothered me only vaguely. Mine was the same psychology that makes Negroes even today, though it bothers them down inside, keep letting the white man tell them how much progress they're making. They've heard it so much, they've almost gotten brainwashed into believing it, or at least accepting it. After the basketball games, there would usually be a school dance. Whenever our team walked into another school's gym for the dance, with me among them, I could feel the freeze. It would start to ease as they saw I didn't try to mix but stuck close to someone on our team or kept to myself. I think I developed ways to do it without making it obvious. Even at our own school, I could sense it, almost as a physical barrier, that despite all the beaming and smiling, the mascot wasn't supposed to dance with any of the white girls. It was some kind of psychic message, not just from them, but also from within myself. I am proud to be able to say that much for myself, at least. I would just stand around and smile and talk and drink punch and eat sandwiches, and then I would make some excuse and get away early. They were typical small-town dances. Sometimes a little white band from Lansing would be brought in to play, but most often the music was a phonograph set up on a table with the volume turned up high and the record scratchy, blaring things like Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade, his band was riding high then, or the Ink Spots, who were also very popular, singing If I Didn't Care. I used to spend a lot of time thinking about a peculiar thing. Many of these Mason white boys, like the ones at the Lansing school, especially if they knew me well and if we hung out a lot together, would get me off in a corner somewhere and push me to proposition certain white girls, sometimes their own sisters. They would tell me that they'd already had the girls themselves, including their sisters, or that they were trying to and couldn't. Later on, I came to understand what was going on. If they could get the girls into the position of having broken the terrible taboo by slipping off with me somewhere, they would have that hammer over the girls' heads to make them give in to them. It seemed that the white boys felt that I, being a Negro, just naturally knew more about romance or sex than they did, that I instinctively knew more about what to do and say with their own girls. I never did tell anybody that I really went for some of the white girls, and some of them went for me too. They let me know in many ways, but anytime we found ourselves in any close conversations or potentially intimate situations, always there would come up between us some kind of a wall. The girls I really wanted to have were a couple of Negro girls whom Wilfred or Filbert had introduced me to in Lansing. But with these girls, somehow, I lacked the nerve. From what I heard and saw on the Saturday nights I spent hanging around in the Negro district, I knew that race mixing went on in Lansing. But strangely enough, this didn't have any kind of effect on me. Every Negro in Lansing, I guess, knew how white men would drive along certain streets in the black neighborhoods and pick up Negro streetwalkers who patrolled the area. And on the other hand, there was a bridge that separated the Negro and Polish neighborhoods, where white women would drive or walk across to pick up Negro men, who would hang around in certain places close to the bridge waiting for them. Lansing's white women, even in those days, were famous for chasing Negro men. I didn't yet appreciate how most whites accord to the Negro this reputation for prodigious sexual prowess. There in Lansing, I never heard of any trouble about this mixing from either side. I imagine that everyone simply took it for granted, as I did. Anyway, from my experience as a little boy at the Lansing school, I had become fairly adept at avoiding the white girl issue, at least for a couple of years yet. Then, in the second semester of the 7th grade, I was elected class president. It surprised me even more than other people. But I can see now why the class might have done it. My grades were among the highest in the school. I was unique in my class like a pink poodle. And I was proud. I'm not going to say I wasn't. In fact, by then, I didn't really have much feeling about being a Negro because I was trying so hard in every way I could to be white, which is why I am spending much of my life today telling the American black man that he's wasting his time straining to integrate. I know from personal experience, I tried hard enough.